You're standing on the deck of a luxury cruise ship, the Mediterranean sun warming your face as you sip champagne and watch the endless blue horizon. You've paid thousands for this dream vacation, believing you're about to experience paradise on the high seas. But what you don't know is that you've just boarded a floating nightmare where people vanish without a trace, where bodies decompose in makeshift morgues while the party continues above, and where the crew you trust with your life might be the very ones you should fear most. Tonight, I'm going to share with you 11 of the most disturbing true stories that have happened aboard cruise ships. Stories so horrifying that they'll make you question everything you thought you knew about these floating cities of supposed luxury. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are documented incidents that actually happened to real people. People just like you who thought they were embarking on the vacation of a lifetime. From passengers who discovered rotting corpses hidden in the ship's bowels, to honeymooners who survived 18 hours in shark-infested waters after falling overboard. These stories will shatter your perception of cruise ship safety forever. If you're ready to dive into the dark underbelly of the cruise industry and discover the terrifying secrets that happen when you're trapped in the middle of the ocean with nowhere to run, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for verified fears, because you definitely don't want to miss what's coming next. Trust me, after hearing these stories, you'll never look at a cruise ship the same way again. Let's begin with our first nightmare at sea. Jackson Rivera had been looking forward to this cruise for months. At 67, the retired insurance adjuster from Miami had finally convinced his wife Maria to splurge on their dream vacation. A 14-day Mediterranean cruise aboard the Oceanic Majesty. After 42 years of marriage, 3 kids, and a lifetime of putting everyone else's needs first, this was supposed to be their time. Their golden years moment of pure, unadulterated bliss floating across the sapphire waters of the Mediterranean. The ship was magnificent, standing 12 decks high with a capacity for 4,000 passengers. It was a floating city of luxury that promised endless entertainment, gourmet dining, and the kind of pampering that Jackson had only dreamed about during his decades of processing insurance claims. The marble-floored atrium stretched 3 stories high, crowned by a crystal chandelier that cast dancing rainbows across the walls. Everywhere Jackson looked, he saw polished brass, rich mahogany, and smiling crew members eager to fulfill every whim. For the first 5 days, everything was perfect. Jackson and Maria dined at the captain's table, danced under the stars on the upper deck, and explored the ship's amenities like excited teenagers. They took cooking classes, attended Broadway-style shows, and spent lazy afternoons by the pool reading novels they'd been putting off for years. Jackson even tried his hand at the rock-climbing wall, much to Maria's amused horror. This was the retirement they'd earned, the payoff for a lifetime of responsibility and sacrifice. But on the 6th morning, as they sailed between the Greek islands of Santorini and Mykonos, Jackson woke up feeling strange. There was a tightness in his chest, a dull ache that seemed to radiate down his left arm. He'd been experiencing these symptoms sporadically for the past few months, but his doctor had assured him it was just stress from retirement adjustment. Nothing to worry about, he'd been told. Just take it easy and enjoy yourself. Maybe I overdid it at the buffet last night, Jackson told Maria as they dressed for breakfast. The pain was getting worse, but he didn't want to alarm his wife. This was supposed to be their perfect vacation, and he wasn't about to ruin it with health complaints. Besides, they were in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. What could a ship's doctor do that his own physician back home couldn't? They made their way to the dining room, Jackson trying to ignore the increasing pressure in his chest. The room was bustling with the usual morning crowd, families with excited children, retired couples like themselves, and young honeymooners still glowing with newlywed bliss. The smell of fresh pastries and coffee should have been enticing, but Jackson found himself feeling nauseous. "Are you sure you're okay?" Maria asked, her brown eyes creased with concern as she watched her husband push eggs around his plate. "You look pale." "I'm fine," Jackson insisted, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Just tired. Maybe we should skip the shore excursion today and relax by the pool." But even as he spoke, Jackson knew something was seriously wrong. The pain in his chest had intensified into a crushing sensation, as if an invisible hand was squeezing his heart. His breathing became shallow and labored, each inhale requiring tremendous effort. The cheerful chatter around him seemed to fade into a distant buzz, and the elegant dining room began to spin. "Jackson!" Maria's voice sounded far away, though she was sitting right beside him. "Jackson, what's wrong?" He tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. The crushing pain exploded through his chest like a detonation, radiating down both arms and up into his jaw. His vision blurred, and he felt himself sliding sideways in his chair. The last thing he remembered before everything went black was the sound of his coffee cup shattering on the marble floor, and Maria's desperate screams for help. What happened next would become the stuff of nightmares for Maria, and a cautionary tale that the cruise industry would desperately try to bury. The ship's medical staff responded quickly, but their small infirmary was equipped to handle minor injuries and seasickness, not major cardiac events. Despite their best efforts, Jackson Rivera was pronounced dead at 9:47 a.m., approximately 30 minutes after his massive heart attack began. The ship's doctor, Dr. Elena Vasquez, had done everything possible, but Jackson's heart had simply given out. At 67, after a lifetime of good health, he had died doing what he loved most, sharing a quiet breakfast with the woman he'd loved for nearly half a century. But this is where the story takes a dark and disturbing turn that would forever change how Maria viewed not just cruise ships, but the entire travel industry. According to standard protocol, Jackson's body should have been immediately transferred to the ship's morgue, a small refrigerated compartment designed to preserve remains until the vessel could reach the next port. However, what Maria didn't know was that the Oceanic Majesty was currently carrying 3 other deceased passengers, and the morgue was at capacity. The ship's crew, unwilling to disrupt the vacation atmosphere or deal with the logistical nightmare of an emergency port call, made a decision that would haunt Maria for the rest of her life. They placed Jackson's body in a maintenance storage room. For 6 days, as the Oceanic Majesty continued its leisurely journey through the Mediterranean, Jackson's remains lay in an unrefrigerated storage space next to paint cans and cleaning supplies. The crew told Maria that everything was being handled properly, that her husband was being cared for with dignity and respect. They assured her that his body would be transferred to proper funeral facilities as soon as they reached the next suitable port. What they didn't tell her was that without proper refrigeration, Jackson's body had begun to decompose. Above deck, the cruise continued as if nothing had happened. Passengers danced at the nightly shows, gorged themselves at the buffets, and laughed by the pools. Children splashed in the water while their parents sipped cocktails and planned their next shore excursion. The ship's photographers continued to snap cheerful vacation photos, and the entertainment staff led conga lines through the corridors. Life aboard the Oceanic Majesty went on exactly as it had before, with one glaring exception. Jackson Rivera was rotting in a storage closet below deck. Maria spent those 6 days in a haze of grief and confusion. The cruise staff had been sympathetic but vague about the details, telling her only that arrangements were being made and that she should try to rest. Well-meaning passengers offered condolences and shared their own stories of loss. But Maria felt completely alone in her floating prison. Every meal, every sunset, every moment of beauty only reminded her that Jackson wasn't there to share it with her. When the ship finally docked in Barcelona, Maria was told that she could collect her husband's remains from the local mortuary. Exhausted and emotionally drained, she made her way to the facility, expecting to find Jackson's body properly prepared for transport back to the United States. Instead, she discovered a horror that would require years of therapy to overcome. The mortuary director, a kind but direct man named Carlos Mendoza, had to gently explain to Maria that her husband's body had been severely compromised by improper storage. After 6 days without refrigeration, decomposition had advanced to the point where a traditional viewing would be impossible. The man who had been her partner for 42 years, who had laughed with her at breakfast just a week earlier, was now unrecognizable. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Rivera," Carlos said softly, his heavily accented English filled with genuine sympathy. "But you must understand, this should never have happened. Your husband deserved better than this." The full scope of the cruise line's negligence became clear during the investigation that followed. Not only had they failed to properly preserve Jackson's remains, but they had also lied repeatedly to Maria about the situation. Internal emails later revealed that crew members had joked about the smell coming from storage room C7 and had used air fresheners to mask the odor of decomposition. The ship's captain had been informed of the situation, but had chosen to prioritize the cruise schedule over basic human dignity. Maria's lawsuit against the cruise line would eventually result in a $1.2 million settlement. But no amount of money could restore her husband's dignity or erase the trauma she had endured. The legal documents revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident. The cruise industry had a pattern of mishandling deceased passengers, treating them as inconveniences rather than human beings deserving of respect. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Jackson's story wasn't the negligence itself, but the calculated way the cruise line had continued operations as if nothing had happened. While Maria grieved and Jackson's body deteriorated, the ship's crew had maintained the illusion of paradise. They had served meals, organized activities, and smiled at passengers, all while knowing that a man's remains were rotting just a few decks below the party. The investigation also revealed that the ship's morgue had been at capacity because the cruise line had a policy of delaying port calls for deceased passengers to avoid disrupting their schedule. They prioritized profit over human dignity, treating death as a customer service issue rather than a solemn responsibility. Jackson Rivera had boarded the Oceanic Majesty expecting the vacation of a lifetime. Instead, he became a victim of an industry that views passengers as nothing more than revenue streams, even in death. His story serves as a reminder that behind the glossy brochures and smiling advertisements, cruise ships are businesses first and foremost. And sometimes, business considerations override basic human decency. For Maria, the Mediterranean cruise that was supposed to be the beginning of their golden years became the end of her faith in the travel industry. She returned to Miami alone, carrying memories of a vacation that had transformed from a dream into a nightmare. And somewhere in the depths of the Oceanic Majesty, Storage Room C7 still carries the lingering reminder of what happens when profit margins matter more than human dignity. The cruise industry would prefer that stories like Jackson's remain buried, hidden beneath layers of legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements. But the truth has a way of surfacing, just like the bodies that are sometimes found floating in the wake of these floating cities. And sometimes, the most horrifying cruise ship stories are the ones that happen after the passengers have already died. Let's move to our second story. Peyton Williams had dreamed of this moment for years. At 28, she had finally saved enough money for the honeymoon cruise she and her husband Derek had been planning since their engagement. The Carnival Triumph stretched before them like a floating palace, its 14 decks promising endless adventure and luxury as they departed from Galveston, Texas, bound for the warm waters of the Caribbean. This was supposed to be the perfect beginning to their new life together. 5 days of pure bliss celebrating their love in paradise. The ship was magnificent in its sheer scale, carrying over 4,000 passengers and crew members. Peyton marveled at the multiple pools, the elaborate dining rooms, and the Broadway-style theater where they'd watched their first show together as a married couple. Their interior cabin on Deck 6 was small but cozy, and they'd spent their first night giggling like teenagers as they explored every amenity the ship had to offer. The buffet alone seemed to stretch for miles, offering everything from sushi to barbecue, and Peyton had already taken dozens of photos to share with friends back home. But on the second day of their cruise, February 10th, 2013, everything changed in an instant. Peyton was lounging by the pool, reading a romance novel and sipping a frozen daiquiri, when she heard the ship's alarm system blare to life. The sound was unlike anything she'd ever heard. A deep, penetrating wail that seemed to come from the very bones of the vessel. Around her, passengers looked up from their drinks and conversations, confusion etched on their sun-kissed faces. The ship's cheerful background music cut off abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made Peyton's skin crawl. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's voice over the intercom, his usual jovial tone replaced by something much more serious. "We are experiencing a technical difficulty in the engine room. Please remain calm and await further instructions." Derek found Peyton at the pool 20 minutes later, his face pale despite his tropical tan. "I was talking to one of the crew members," he whispered, pulling her aside. "There's been a fire in the engine room. They've lost power to the main engines." At first, the situation seemed manageable. The crew assured passengers that backup generators would maintain essential services while repairs were made. The ship's entertainment staff even organized impromptu deck parties, encouraging everyone to make the best of an unexpected adventure. Peyton and Derek joined a conga line that snaked around the upper deck, laughing and dancing as if nothing was wrong. The bar remained open, the music played on, and for a few hours, it almost felt like a unique bonding experience, something they'd laugh about for years to come. But as the hours turned into a full day, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The Carnival Triumph was dead in the water, drifting aimlessly in the Gulf of Mexico with no power to its main engines. The air conditioning had failed, and the ship's interior temperature began to climb steadily. By the second day, it was sweltering inside the corridors, and passengers had begun gathering on the outer decks simply to escape the suffocating heat below. Then the toilets stopped working. With no power to the ship's sewage system, the bathrooms became unusable within hours. Peyton first noticed the smell during what should have been a romantic dinner at the ship's main dining room. It was subtle at first, a faint, unpleasant odor that seemed to drift in and out with the ship's gentle rocking. But as the evening progressed, the smell intensified, becoming a nauseating stench that made eating impossible. "This is disgusting," Derek muttered, pushing away his plate of what had been advertised as prime rib but now seemed revolting in the face of the overwhelming odor. How are we supposed to eat with this smell? By the third day, the situation had deteriorated into something resembling a floating nightmare. The sewage system had completely failed, and raw waste began backing up into passenger bathrooms and corridors. Peyton watched in horror as brown water seeped under their cabin door, forcing them to pile towels around the entrance in a desperate attempt to keep the filth out. The carpets in the hallways were soaked with sewage, and passengers had to navigate the ship's interior wearing plastic bags over their shoes. The crew distributed red biohazard bags to every passenger, explaining with barely concealed panic that these would serve as their toilets for the remainder of the voyage. Peyton stared at the flimsy plastic bag in her hands, unable to comprehend that this was what her dream honeymoon had become. Around her, fellow passengers were having similar realizations. Families with young children, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries, and other newlyweds like herself, all reduced to using plastic bags as bathroom facilities. "I can't do this," Peyton whispered to Derek as they stood in line for food distribution on the ship's upper deck. The formal dining rooms had been abandoned due to the overwhelming stench, and meals were now being served outside in a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy. This isn't how our honeymoon was supposed to go. But Derek, ever the optimist, squeezed her hand tightly. "We're going to get through this together," he said firmly. "Someday we'll look back on this and laugh. Our kids are going to love hearing about how their parents survived the infamous poop cruise." The nickname had already begun circulating among passengers, the poop cruise, a darkly humorous reference to their increasingly desperate situation. Social media posts from those with working cell phones had begun dubbing the Carnival Triumph the poop ship, and news outlets around the world were picking up the story. But for Peyton and the other passengers trapped aboard, there was nothing funny about their predicament. By the fourth day, the situation had become truly horrific. Sewage was now dripping from the ceiling in many areas of the ship, creating a constant rain of human waste that passengers had to navigate with makeshift umbrellas and garbage bags. The smell was so overwhelming that many people had resorted to breathing through towels soaked in perfume or cologne. Peyton had tied her wedding veil around her face as a makeshift mask, the delicate lace now serving as protection against the nauseating odor that permeated every corner of the vessel. The ship's crew, to their credit, worked tirelessly to maintain order and distribute supplies. They organized bucket brigades to collect rainwater for drinking, since the ship's water system had also been compromised. Peyton found herself working alongside strangers, passing containers of precious fresh water from person to person, united in their shared misery and determination to survive. Food became increasingly scarce as the ship's refrigeration systems failed. What had once been elaborate buffets, featuring fresh seafood and gourmet dishes, was now reduced to cold sandwiches and canned goods distributed from the ship's emergency supplies. Peyton watched as passengers who had been sophisticated and refined just days earlier now fought over packages of crackers and warm soda. The veneer of civilization was peeling away like paint in the tropical heat. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical discomfort. Passengers began to panic as reports filtered in that their rescue might take days longer than initially promised. Children cried constantly, overwhelmed by the heat, smell, and general chaos. Elderly passengers struggled with the physical demands of their situation, and several required medical attention that the ship's overwhelmed medical staff could barely provide. Peyton found herself comforting a young mother whose toddler had developed a severe rash from the unsanitary conditions. The woman sobbed as she explained that her child was scheduled for important medical tests when they returned home, appointments that would now be missed due to their extended ordeal. It was moments like these that drove home the real human cost of their situation. This wasn't just an inconvenience, but a genuine crisis that was affecting people's lives in profound ways. On the fifth day, relief finally came in the form of tugboats that had been dispatched to tow the powerless Carnival Triumph to the port of Mobile, Alabama. Peyton stood on the deck with Derek, watching the distant shoreline grow larger as their floating prison was slowly pulled toward salvation. Around them, passengers cheered and cried, some kissing the deck in gratitude, others simply staring at the approaching land with shell-shocked expressions. But even as rescue approached, the ordeal was far from over. The disembarkation process took hours, as 4,000 passengers had to be processed through a small port facility that had never been designed to handle such an influx. Peyton and Derek waited in line for nearly 6 hours, still surrounded by the overwhelming stench that had become their constant companion, watching as fellow passengers collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. When they finally set foot on solid ground, Peyton's legs nearly gave out. After 5 days of constant motion and stress, the stability of the pier felt almost alien. She and Derek stood there for several minutes, just breathing clean air and marveling at the simple pleasure of being able to walk to a real bathroom whenever they wanted. The aftermath of the poop cruise would define Peyton's relationship with travel for years to come. She and Derek received compensation from Carnival Cruise Lines, along with vouchers for future cruises that they would never use. The experience had created a bond between them that was perhaps stronger than any traditional honeymoon could have forged. But it had also left them with trauma that would take years to process. The Carnival Triumph incident became a landmark case in maritime safety and passenger rights. It exposed the vulnerability of modern cruise ships and the inadequacy of emergency protocols when dealing with catastrophic system failures. But for Peyton, it would always be remembered as the honeymoon that taught her that paradise can become hell in the span of a single moment, and that survival sometimes requires abandoning dignity in favor of basic human endurance. Years later, when friends asked about their honeymoon, Peyton would smile ruefully and explain that they'd learned more about each other in those 5 days than many couples learn in a lifetime. They'd seen each other at their absolute worst, exhausted, filthy, and desperate, and had chosen to love each other anyway. In a twisted way, the poop cruise had given them something that no luxury vacation ever could: the unshakable knowledge that their love could survive absolutely anything. Let's move to our third story. Astrid Larsen had always been a skeptic when it came to ghost stories. At 35, the Norwegian marine biologist had spent her career studying the mysteries of the ocean through scientific observation and empirical evidence. Superstitions and paranormal tales were, in her mind, nothing more than elaborate fiction designed to entertain tourists and sell books. So when she booked a solo cruise aboard the Northern Star for a much-needed break from her research, the last thing she expected was to encounter something that would challenge every rational belief she held about the world. The Northern Star was a smaller, more intimate vessel than the massive floating cities that dominated the cruise industry. With only 1,200 passengers, it offered a quieter, more refined experience as it sailed through the fjords of Norway. Astrid had chosen this particular ship specifically because of its reputation for sophisticated travelers and educational programs. She was looking forward to attending lectures on marine ecology and perhaps observing Arctic wildlife from the comfort of a civilized vessel. Her cabin, 7B, was located on the ship's 7th deck, midway between the main dining areas and the observation lounges. It was a modest interior stateroom with a small sitting area, a comfortable bed, and a compact bathroom. The decor was understated but elegant, featuring rich blues and whites that evoked the Nordic seas. When Astrid first entered the cabin, she was pleased with its cozy atmosphere and the attention to detail in its furnishings. But from the very first night, something felt wrong. Astrid had always been a light sleeper, a trait that served her well during long research expeditions where she needed to monitor equipment throughout the night. So when she was awakened at 2:17 a.m. by the sound of her cabin phone ringing, she was instantly alert. The phone sat on the nightstand just inches from her head, its shrill tone cutting through the gentle hum of the ship's engines like a knife through silk. She reached for the receiver, expecting perhaps a wrong number or some kind of ship-related announcement. "Hello?" she said, her voice still thick with sleep. Silence. Not the empty silence of a disconnected line, but something deeper. A presence that seemed to breathe on the other end of the call. Astrid could hear something that sounded almost like whispers, so faint that she couldn't make out words, but definitely there. The sound raised goosebumps on her arms, despite the cabin's comfortable temperature. "Hello?" she repeated more firmly this time. "Is someone there?" The line went dead. Astrid hung up the phone and tried to dismiss the incident as a technical glitch. Cruise ships were floating cities with complex communication systems, and crossed wires or electronic malfunctions were hardly supernatural phenomena. She made a mental note to mention it to guest services in the morning and settled back into her pillow, determined to get back to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. As she lay in the darkness, Astrid became increasingly aware of the sounds around her. The ship's normal operational noises, the hum of ventilation systems, the distant throb of engines, the occasional creak of metal expanding and contracting, seemed amplified and somehow different. There was an underlying sound that she couldn't identify, a low groaning that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The next morning, Astrid mentioned the phone call to the guest services desk. The cheerful young woman behind the counter, whose name tag read Sasha, listened politely but didn't seem particularly concerned. "I'm sorry about that, doctor." "Larson," Sasha said with a practiced smile. "We've been having some issues with our phone system lately. I'll have our technical team look into it. In the meantime, if you receive any more unwanted calls, just unplug the phone." Astrid nodded, satisfied with the explanation. She spent the day attending lectures and exploring the ship's facilities, gradually forgetting about the previous night's disturbance. The ship's naturalist gave a fascinating presentation on Arctic marine life, and she enjoyed a quiet dinner while watching the Norwegian coastline drift by through the dining room's panoramic windows. But that night, the phone rang again. This time, Astrid was ready. She had unplugged the phone before going to bed, following Sasha's advice. So when she heard the familiar shrill ring at exactly 2:17 a.m., she sat up in bed with a start. The phone was clearly unplugged. She could see the cord lying on the nightstand, disconnected from the wall jack. Yet it continued to ring. Astrid stared at the phone in disbelief, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was experiencing. Electronic devices didn't function without power sources. This was impossible. But the ringing continued, mechanical and insistent, echoing through her cabin like a demand for attention. Against her better judgment, she picked up the receiver. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. This time, the whispers were clearer. She could make out fragments of words, spoken in what sounded like multiple voices overlapping each other. The language was unfamiliar, but the tone was unmistakably distressed. Pleading, desperate, filled with a sadness that seemed to reach through the phone line and wrap around her heart like ice. "Please," she heard distinctly, the word cutting through the other whispers like a blade. "Please, help." The line went dead, and Astrid was left holding a phone that couldn't possibly have been working. She examined the device carefully, checking every connection, but there was no way it could have received or transmitted a call. The cord was definitely unplugged, and there were no batteries or alternative power sources visible. Sleep was impossible after that. Astrid spent the remaining hours until dawn researching the ship's history on her laptop, diving deep into maritime records and news archives. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The Northern Star had been in service for less than 5 years, but it had been built using salvaged materials from several older vessels. The phone system, according to technical specifications she found in a maritime industry journal, incorporated components from a ship called the Midnight Sun, which had been decommissioned after a tragic accident in 2018. The Midnight Sun had been carrying Norwegian passengers on a similar Arctic cruise when it encountered a severe storm. The ship had suffered catastrophic damage, and 17 passengers had died when their lifeboat capsized during the evacuation. The victims had been trapped in the freezing water for hours, calling desperately for help that never came. Astrid's hands trembled as she read the passenger manifest from that doomed voyage. Among the victims were entire families, elderly couples, and young professionals. People who had simply wanted to experience the beauty of the Arctic, just like her. The thought that their final moments had been spent crying out for rescue that never arrived filled her with a profound sadness that she couldn't shake. The third night, Astrid decided to stay awake and wait for the phone call. She positioned herself in the cabin's small chair, laptop open, documenting everything she experienced. At 2:17 a.m., the phone rang again, even though she had not only unplugged it, but had also removed the batteries from the base unit. This time, when she answered, the voices were clearer than ever. She could hear names being called: Eric, Mama, help us, and what sounded like prayers in Norwegian. The desperation in those voices was overwhelming, and Astrid found herself crying as she listened to what could only be described as the final pleas of people who had died in terror and confusion. "I hear you," she whispered into the phone. "I know what happened to you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The whispers seemed to intensify, as if her acknowledgement had given them strength. She heard what sounded like gratitude mixed with continued pleading, and then something that chilled her to the bone: the sound of rushing water and desperate gasps for air. When she hung up the phone, Astrid noticed that the cabin's temperature had dropped significantly. Her breath was visible in the air, and frost had begun forming on the bathroom mirror. The groaning sound in the walls had intensified, and she could swear she heard the sound of dripping water coming from somewhere above her head. The next morning, she requested a meeting with the ship's captain. Captain Eriksson was a distinguished man in his 50s who listened to Astrid's account with a mixture of skepticism and concern. But when she mentioned the specific names she had heard in the whispers, his expression changed dramatically. "Dr. Larson," he said quietly. Those are the names of passengers who died on the Midnight Sun. Eric was a young boy, only 7 years old. His mother, Anna, was calling for him when their lifeboat capsized. Captain Erickson went on to explain that several passengers had reported similar experiences in Cabin 7B, which had been constructed using materials from the Midnight Sun's communication center. The ship's owners had tried to address the problem by blessing the room and bringing in engineers to replace the phone system. But the phenomena persisted. "We've moved you to a different cabin," he said, handing her a new key card. "Deck 5, away from any salvaged materials. I hope you can finish your cruise in peace." But even in her new cabin, Astrid couldn't escape the experiences of 7B. Every night at 2:17 a.m., she would wake up with the overwhelming sensation that she was being watched. She would hear faint whispers coming from the ventilation system, and occasionally she would find wet handprints on her bathroom mirror, small ones that could have belonged to a child. The ship's other passengers began to notice her increasingly haggard appearance. Fellow travelers would approach her with concern, asking if she was feeling well or if she needed medical attention. But how could she explain that she was being contacted by the dead? That the victims of a maritime disaster were somehow reaching out to her through the ship's infrastructure? On her final night aboard the Northern Star, Astrid made a decision that would change her life forever. She returned to Cabin 7B. The room was supposed to be empty. The ship's crew had stopped booking passengers into it after too many complaints. But Astrid had convinced a sympathetic crew member to let her spend one last night there, claiming she wanted to conduct a scientific investigation into the alleged phenomena. At 2:17 a.m., the phone rang for the final time. When Astrid answered, the voices were different, calmer, more peaceful. She heard what sounded like expressions of gratitude, and then, clearly and distinctly, a child's voice saying, "Thank you, lady. We can rest now." The line went dead, and Astrid felt a profound sense of peace settle over the cabin. The temperature returned to normal. The mysterious groaning sound stopped, and for the first time in days, she felt truly alone in the room. When she disembarked in Bergen the next morning, Astrid was fundamentally changed. The scientist who had boarded the ship believing only in empirical evidence had been replaced by someone who understood that the ocean holds mysteries that cannot be explained by conventional means. She had been chosen, somehow, to help troubled souls find peace, and that responsibility would guide her actions for the rest of her life. The Northern Star continued its regular cruise schedule, but Cabin 7B remained empty. The ship's crew reported that the strange phenomena had stopped completely after Astrid's final night in the room, as if her acknowledgement of the victims had somehow allowed them to move on to whatever comes after death. For Astrid, the experience marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She continued her marine biology research, but she also began investigating other maritime mysteries, documenting cases where the line between the living and the dead seemed to blur. She had learned that some stories are too important to be dismissed as mere superstition, and that sometimes the most profound truth can be found in the spaces between science and the supernatural. The phone calls had stopped, but the memory of those desperate voices would stay with her forever. A reminder that the ocean never truly gives up its dead, and sometimes they find ways to reach out to the living, seeking the peace that can only come from being heard, acknowledged, and remembered. Let's move to our fourth story. Marcus Rivera never should have been on that cruise ship balcony with Diana Walsh at 2:30 in the morning. He certainly never should have been drinking whiskey straight from the bottle while his wife slept peacefully in their cabin 3 decks below. And he definitely never should have been having an affair with his business partner's wife during what was supposed to be a company retreat cruise through the Caribbean. But poor decisions had a way of cascading into catastrophe. And Marcus was about to learn that lesson in the most terrifying way possible. The Caribbean Princess was a floating palace designed for corporate events and luxury vacations. Marcus's marketing firm had chartered the ship for their annual company retreat, bringing along 200 employees and their families for a week of team-building activities and tropical relaxation. It should have been a perfect opportunity to strengthen professional relationships and reward his hard-working staff. Instead, it had become the setting for a forbidden romance that was about to turn deadly. Diana Walsh was everything Marcus's wife, Jennifer, wasn't. Spontaneous, reckless, and dangerously seductive. Where Jennifer was conservative and practical, Diana was wild and unpredictable. She had been pursuing Marcus for months, sending him suggestive texts during board meetings and finding excuses to work late when she knew he'd be in the office alone. The cruise had provided the perfect opportunity for their relationship to escalate beyond flirtation into something much more dangerous. They had been meeting secretly every night on the ship's upper deck, sharing drinks and stolen kisses while their respective spouses attended the evening entertainment programs. It was a thrilling game of deception that made Marcus feel alive in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The danger of being caught only added to the excitement, and the tropical setting made everything feel like a scene from a romantic movie. But on this particular night, both Marcus and Diana had been drinking heavily. They had started with champagne at the captain's dinner, moved on to wine during the late-night jazz performance, and finally graduated to the bottle of premium whiskey that Marcus had smuggled up to the balcony from the ship's duty-free shop. The alcohol had made them careless, their voices louder, their movements less coordinated. "We could do this forever," Diana whispered, wrapping her arms around Marcus's neck as they swayed together on the narrow balcony. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, dark and mysterious under the star-filled sky. Just disappear together. Start over somewhere new. Marcus laughed, the sound slightly slurred but genuine. "You're drunk," he said, but he was smiling as he said it. The idea wasn't entirely unappealing. His marriage to Jennifer had been stagnant for years, reduced to polite conversation and shared responsibilities. Diana represented everything he felt he had been missing. Passion, excitement, the feeling of being truly desired. "Maybe I am," Diana replied, pressing closer to him. "But I'm also serious. We could make this work, Marcus. We could be happy." The ship's motion seemed more pronounced on the upper deck, and Marcus had to steady himself against the railing as a larger wave caused the vessel to rock. The whiskey bottle slipped from his hand, shattering on the balcony floor and sending amber liquid cascading toward the drain. The sound was startling in the quiet night, and both Marcus and Diana froze, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. "We should go back," Marcus said, his practical side finally asserting itself through the alcohol-induced haze. "If someone sees us..." But Diana wasn't ready to end their romantic encounter. She pulled him closer, her lips finding his in a passionate kiss that tasted of whiskey and danger. Marcus felt himself responding despite his better judgment, his hands tangling in her hair as they pressed against each other in the narrow balcony space. It was their desperate embrace that saved their lives and nearly ended them at the same time. As they kissed, Marcus stepped backward, his foot slipping on the spilled whiskey. He grabbed for the railing to steady himself, but his grip was compromised by the alcohol and the slick surface. Diana, still clinging to him, was pulled along as he tumbled over the safety barrier. In a moment of pure instinct, she wrapped her arms around his waist, and together they plummeted 40 feet into the dark Caribbean waters below. The impact was like hitting concrete. Marcus felt the air driven from his lungs as he struck the water, the cold ocean shocking his system and instantly sobering him. Beside him, Diana surfaced, gasping and sputtering, her evening dress already dragging her down with its waterlogged weight. Above them, the massive cruise ship continued its steady course, its lights growing smaller with each passing second. "Help!" Diana screamed, her voice barely audible over the sound of the ship's engines and the gentle lapping of waves. "Somebody help us." But Marcus realized with growing horror that no one had witnessed their fall. The company retreat passengers were all in their cabins or enjoying the late-night entertainment venues. The ship's crew was focused on their duties, and the upper deck balconies were supposed to be empty at this hour. They had chosen the perfect location for their secret meetings, and now that isolation was going to kill them. The Caribbean Princess was already several hundred yards away, its massive bulk disappearing into the darkness like a floating city, abandoning them to the merciless ocean. Marcus treaded water desperately, his business suit becoming increasingly heavy as it absorbed seawater. Beside him, Diana was struggling even more, her dress acting like an anchor that threatened to drag her beneath the surface. "We have to get out of these clothes," Marcus gasped, his voice barely audible over the sound of waves. "They're going to drag us down." With tremendous effort, Marcus managed to shed his suit jacket and shoes, immediately feeling lighter in the water. Diana was having more difficulty with her dress, and Marcus had to help her remove the heavy fabric while both of them fought to stay afloat. The process was exhausting and terrifying, made worse by the realization that they were completely alone in the vast ocean with no hope of immediate rescue. "How long do you think we can survive out here?" Diana asked, her voice tight with panic as she struggled to keep her head above water. Marcus tried to calculate their chances, but the numbers were terrifying. The water temperature was probably around 78 degrees, warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia, but cold enough to sap their strength over time. Without life preservers or flotation devices, they would have to rely on their swimming ability and sheer determination to survive until rescue arrived. If rescue arrived, it was Diana who came up with a solution that would ultimately save their lives. "Our genes," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through Marcus's growing despair. "I remember reading something about using pants as flotation devices." Marcus had heard the same survival tip, though he'd never imagined he would have to put it into practice. Working together, they managed to remove their remaining clothes while treading water, a process that required incredible coordination and trust. Then, following half-remembered instructions from survival guides, they tied off the legs of their jeans and inflated them by trapping air inside the fabric. The makeshift flotation devices were far from perfect, but they provided enough buoyancy to keep their heads above water without constant effort. Marcus felt a surge of hope as he realized they might actually have a chance of surviving until morning, when their absence would surely be noticed and a search would begin. But surviving the night was only the beginning of their ordeal. As the hours passed, Marcus and Diana found themselves facing challenges they had never imagined. The ocean at night was alive with creatures that seemed drawn to their presence. Jellyfish drifted past like ghostly umbrellas, their translucent bodies pulsing with an eerie bioluminescence. Several times, Marcus felt tentacles brush against his legs, sending jolts of stinging pain through his body. "Don't panic," he told Diana as she cried out after another jellyfish encounter. "The stings hurt, but they're not fatal. We just have to endure it." But the jellyfish were nothing compared to the psychological terror of being lost at sea. Every shadow in the water could be a shark. Every sound could be a predator approaching. The ocean that had seemed so beautiful and peaceful from the ship's deck now felt like a hostile alien environment designed to kill them slowly. As dawn approached, both Marcus and Diana were showing signs of severe exhaustion and dehydration. The salt water had burned their throats raw, and their lips were cracked and bleeding. Their improvised flotation devices were losing air, requiring constant reinflation that sapped their remaining energy. "I can't do this much longer," Diana whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so tired." Marcus felt the same crushing fatigue, but he forced himself to stay alert. Giving up now would mean certain death, and despite everything that had led them to this moment, he wasn't ready to die. "Just a little longer," he encouraged her. "Someone will find us soon." It was the sound of helicopter rotors that finally brought salvation. The Coast Guard search and rescue team had been alerted when Marcus and Diana failed to appear for the morning company breakfast. A full-scale search had been launched, with helicopters and boats combing the area where the couple had presumably fallen overboard. The rescue itself was both terrifying and miraculous. Marcus and Diana were pulled from the water after 18 hours of fighting for survival, their bodies badly sunburned and covered in jellyfish stings. They were dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from the early stages of hypothermia, but they were alive. The aftermath of their rescue was almost as traumatic as the experience itself. Their affair was now public knowledge, destroying both of their marriages and Marcus's business partnership. The company retreat ended in scandal, with employees gossiping about the dramatic rescue and the circumstances that had led to it. But Marcus and Diana had learned something profound during their night in the ocean. They had discovered what they were truly capable of when faced with life-or-death circumstances. The affair that had seemed so important on the ship's deck paled in comparison to the simple miracle of survival. Their relationship didn't survive the return to dry land. The trauma of their experience, combined with the wreckage of their respective marriages, proved too much to overcome. But they had saved each other's lives in the most literal sense, and that bond would connect them forever. Marcus often thought about that night in the years that followed. The decisions that had led to their fall had been reckless and selfish. But their survival had required courage, ingenuity, and an unbreakable will to live. They had faced the ocean's vast indifference and emerged victorious, if forever changed by the experience. The Caribbean Princess continued its regular cruise schedule, but new safety protocols were implemented after the incident. Higher railings, better lighting, and increased security patrols were designed to prevent similar accidents. But Marcus knew that no amount of safety equipment could protect people from their own poor judgment and the unpredictable nature of the sea. The ocean had tested them in the most fundamental way possible, and they had passed. But the cost of that test, their marriages, their friendship, their former lives, served as a reminder that survival sometimes requires sacrificing everything you thought you wanted in favor of the one thing that truly matters: staying alive. Let's move to our fifth story. The Royal Caribbean Navigator was supposed to be the perfect family vacation for the Harrison family. Mark and Susan had saved for 2 years to afford this Mediterranean cruise. planning every detail to ensure their 14-year-old daughter Taylor would have the experience of a lifetime. The ship's teen club had come highly recommended, with supervised activities and trustworthy staff members who were supposedly trained to handle teenagers with care and professionalism. What they didn't know was that predators often seek out positions that give them access to vulnerable young people. And cruise ships provide the perfect hunting ground for those with sinister intentions. Taylor Harrison was an innocent girl from suburban Ohio who had never traveled farther than her grandmother's house in Kentucky. At 14, she was at that awkward age where she wanted to be treated like an adult, but still needed the protection and guidance of her parents. The cruise represented freedom and adventure, a chance to explore independence while still being safely supervised. She was excited about the teen club activities and the opportunity to meet other young people from around the world. The teen club coordinator was a charming 26-year-old man named Jake Morrison, who had been working on cruise ships for 3 years. He was handsome, charismatic, and had an easy way with teenagers that made parents feel comfortable leaving their children in his care. Jake had impeccable references and had passed all the background checks required for working with minors. What the cruise line didn't know was that Jake had perfected the art of manipulation, carefully crafting his persona to gain the trust of both parents and children. From the moment Taylor entered the teen club, Jake singled her out for special attention. He complimented her intelligence, praised her maturity, and made her feel like she was the most interesting person on the ship. For a teenager who often felt overlooked and awkward, this attention was intoxicating. Jake had a gift for making young people feel special and mature, and Taylor quickly developed what she thought was a friendship with the cool older guy who seemed to understand her better than anyone else. "You're not like the other kids," Jake told Taylor during their second day at sea, his voice low and conspiratorial as they stood apart from the group during a deck game. "You're more mature, more thoughtful. I can tell you're going to do great things with your life." Taylor blushed at the compliment, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that she didn't quite understand. No adult had ever spoken to her like this before, like she was an equal, like her thoughts and opinions mattered. Her parents, while loving, still treated her like a child, and her teachers at school saw her as just another student to manage. Jake made her feel special in a way that was completely new and thrilling. Over the next few days, Jake began isolating Taylor from the other teenagers, convincing her that she was too sophisticated for their childish games and conversations. He would invite her to help him with special projects, like organizing supplies or planning activities, tasks that required them to be alone together in storage rooms or empty areas of the ship. These moments of privacy allowed Jake to gradually break down Taylor's boundaries, testing how far he could push without triggering her alarm bells. "I really appreciate your help," Jake would say, standing closer to her than necessary as they sorted through activity supplies. "You're so much more responsible than the other kids. I feel like I can trust you with important things." The grooming process was methodical and calculated. Jake would share personal stories about his own difficult childhood, creating a sense of intimacy and trust. He would ask Taylor about her family problems, her insecurities, and her dreams for the future, gathering information he could use to manipulate her emotions. When Taylor mentioned feeling misunderstood by her parents, Jake would nod sympathetically and tell her that adults often failed to recognize the maturity of young people like her. By the 4th day of the cruise, Jake had successfully isolated Taylor from her peers and established himself as her primary source of validation and attention. He began introducing physical contact gradually, a hand on her shoulder, a hug that lasted a little too long. Casual touches that made Taylor feel both excited and confused. She had never experienced this kind of attention from an older man, and she didn't have the experience to recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior. The assault happened on the 5th night of the cruise, in a storage room adjacent to the teen club where Jake had lured Taylor under the pretense of helping him prepare for the next day's activities. The room was soundproofed and located in a part of the ship where foot traffic was minimal during evening hours. Jake had chosen the location carefully, knowing that Taylor's cries for help would not be heard by anyone who might intervene. What happened in that storage room would haunt Taylor for years to come. Jake's careful grooming had left her confused and vulnerable, unsure whether she was partially responsible for what occurred. The assault was brutal and traumatic, but Jake's psychological manipulation had been so effective that Taylor initially blamed herself for the incident. She had trusted him, had been alone with him willingly, and had even felt special because of his attention. In her 14-year-old mind, she believed she had somehow brought this horror upon herself. After the assault, Jake's demeanor changed completely. The charming, understanding mentor was replaced by someone cold and threatening. He told Taylor that no one would believe her story, that she would be blamed for being alone with him, and that her parents would be ashamed of her behavior. He convinced her that reporting the incident would only bring more pain and humiliation, and that the best thing she could do was pretend nothing had happened. "Think about what this would do to your parents," Jake said, his voice now menacing rather than kind. "They saved for years for this vacation. Do you really want to ruin it for them? And what would people think about a girl who goes alone with a man to a storage room? They'd say you asked for it." Taylor returned to her family that night, broken and traumatized. But she said nothing about what had happened. She couldn't eat dinner, claiming she felt seasick, and she avoided the teen club for the remainder of the cruise. Her parents noticed the change in her behavior, but attributed it to typical teenage mood swings and the adjustment to being away from home. The psychological damage was immediate and severe. Taylor began experiencing nightmares, panic attacks, and a deep sense of shame that she couldn't shake. She withdrew from her family and friends, no longer able to enjoy activities that had once brought her pleasure. The cruise that was supposed to be a highlight of her childhood had become a source of trauma that would affect every aspect of her life. For months after returning home, Taylor kept the secret of what had happened to her. She threw herself into her schoolwork, trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy while battling the psychological aftermath of the assault. She couldn't concentrate in class, had difficulty sleeping, and began experiencing severe anxiety in social situations. Her grades began to suffer, and her parents grew increasingly concerned about her apparent depression. The truth finally came out 6 months later, during a family therapy session that Mark and Susan had arranged to help Taylor deal with what they thought was typical teenage depression. When the therapist asked about any traumatic experiences, Taylor finally broke down and revealed what Jake Morrison had done to her during the cruise. The revelation destroyed the Harrison family's sense of security and trust. Mark and Susan were horrified that they had unknowingly placed their daughter in danger, and they were devastated by the knowledge that she had suffered in silence for so long. They immediately contacted the cruise line and law enforcement. But the investigation was complicated by the international nature of cruise ship jurisdiction and the time that had passed since the incident. Jake Morrison had left the cruise line shortly after the Harrison family's voyage, citing personal reasons for his departure. When investigators finally tracked him down, they discovered that Taylor was not his only victim. 3 other families had come forward with similar stories about their teenage daughters, all following the same pattern of grooming, isolation, and assault. Jake had perfected his predatory techniques over years of working with vulnerable young people, and the cruise ship environment had provided him with the perfect opportunity to exploit their trust. The legal proceedings were lengthy and complicated, involving multiple jurisdictions and the complex web of international maritime law. The cruise line settled out of court with the Harrison family and the other victims, paying substantial damages while admitting no wrongdoing. Jake Morrison was eventually convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But the damage to his victims was already done. Taylor's recovery was a long and difficult process that required years of therapy and the unwavering support of her family. She had to learn to trust again, to understand that the assault was not her fault, and to reclaim her sense of self-worth. The experience had robbed her of her innocence and her ability to feel safe in the world, but it had also revealed her inner strength and resilience. The incident led to significant changes in how cruise lines screen and supervise their youth program staff. Background checks became more thorough, supervision protocols were strengthened, and training programs were implemented to help staff recognize the signs of predatory behavior. But for Taylor and the other victims, these changes came too late to prevent the trauma they had endured. Years later, Taylor would become an advocate for other survivors of sexual assault, using her experience to help young people recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior and to encourage victims to speak out about their experiences. She learned that silence only protects predators, and that breaking the cycle of abuse requires courage and the support of caring adults. The cruise industry's dirty secret is that predators are drawn to environments where they have access to vulnerable young people, and cruise ships provide the perfect hunting ground for those with sinister intentions. The isolated nature of ships at sea, combined with a relaxed vacation atmosphere, creates conditions where abuse can occur and victims can be silenced. Taylor's story is not unique. It is representative of countless young people who have been victimized by trusted authority figures in positions of power. For Mark and Susan Harrison, the experience forever changed how they viewed their role as parents and protectors. They learned that evil can hide behind a friendly smile and impressive credentials, and that their most important job was not to provide their daughter with perfect experiences, but to create an environment where she felt safe enough to tell them when something was wrong. The Royal Caribbean Navigator continues to sail the Mediterranean, carrying new families on dream vacations and creating memories that will last a lifetime. But for those who know the truth about what can happen in the hidden corners of these floating cities, the sparkle of the ocean and the promise of adventure will always be tinged with the knowledge that predators walk among us, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Taylor's story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous threats to our children often come from those we trust most, and that the price of safety is eternal vigilance. In a world where predators actively seek out positions of authority and trust, parents must remain alert to the signs of grooming and manipulation, and children must be taught that adults who ask them to keep secrets are not to be trusted. The teen club might look like innocent fun from the outside, but for Taylor Harrison, it became the setting for a nightmare that would haunt her for years to come. Her courage in finally speaking out not only brought her abuser to justice, but also helped protect other young people from suffering the same fate. Sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that are hardest to tell, and Taylor's voice became a beacon of hope for other survivors who had been silenced by shame and fear. Let's move to our sixth story. Vincent Kowalski had been drinking since noon, and by 11:30 p.m., He was the kind of drunk that made other passengers cross to the other side of the deck to avoid him. The 42-year-old construction foreman from Detroit had boarded the Carnival Breeze with his wife Linda for what was supposed to be a second honeymoon, a last-ditch effort to save their 20-year marriage that had been crumbling under the weight of his alcoholism and explosive temper. Instead, the cruise had become a floating battleground where their problems were magnified by the claustrophobic environment and Vincent's unlimited access to alcohol. The Carnival Breeze was a massive ship carrying over 3,000 passengers, but Vincent managed to make himself known to a significant portion of them during his 4-day reign of terror. He had been cut off from 3 different bars, had gotten into a screaming match with a family at the buffet, and had made several female passengers uncomfortable with his aggressive behavior and inappropriate comments. The ship's security team had already issued 2 warnings, and Vincent was teetering on the edge of being confined to his cabin for the remainder of the voyage. Linda Kowalski was a patient woman who had endured 2 decades of Vincent's drinking and the accompanying verbal abuse that came with it. She had hoped that the cruise would provide a neutral environment where they could rediscover the love that had once brought them together. Instead, she found herself apologizing to strangers for her husband's behavior and spending most of her time hiding in their cabin to avoid the embarrassment of being seen with him in public. The final confrontation began in the ship's main dining room during the late dinner seating. Vincent had somehow managed to convince a server to bring him drinks, despite being officially cut off, and he was holding court at their table with a group of reluctant listeners who were too polite to walk away. His voice was loud and slurred as he regaled them with increasingly inappropriate stories about his construction work and his opinions about various ethnic groups. "You know what your problem is?" Vincent suddenly turned to Linda, his bloodshot eyes focusing on her with a cruel intensity that she had learned to fear. "You're a frigid bitch who can't stand to see a man have a good time. That's why our marriage is shit." The other diners at nearby tables fell silent, their conversation stopping as they stared at the unfolding domestic drama. Linda felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as she realized that dozens of people were witnessing her husband's latest tirade. She had endured this kind of verbal assault countless times in the privacy of their own home. But having it happen in public was a new level of degradation. "Vincent, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the dining room's ambient noise. "Can we just go back to our room? People are staring." But Vincent was beyond reason, his alcohol-soaked brain interpreting her request as a challenge to his authority. He slammed his glass down on the table, sending wine splashing across the white tablecloth and onto the dress of a woman at the adjacent table. The crash was loud enough to get the attention of the entire dining room, and conversation stopped as people turned to stare at the source of the disturbance. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," Vincent snarled, his voice carrying across the previously civilized dining room. "I paid for this fucking cruise, and I'll do whatever I want. If you don't like it, you can get the hell out." Linda stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she placed her napkin on the table. She had reached her breaking point after 20 years of marriage, and something inside her finally snapped. The humiliation of having her personal life exposed in front of hundreds of strangers was the final straw that broke her resolve to maintain their facade of normalcy. "I want a divorce," she said quietly, but her words carried clearly in the suddenly silent dining room. "I can't do this anymore, Vincent. I'm done." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow, sobering him slightly, but also igniting a rage that was visible to everyone in the room. He stood up so quickly that his chair toppled backward, and for a moment, Linda thought he might actually strike her in front of all these witnesses. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the dining room, pushing past servers and knocking over a wine display in his fury. Linda followed him at a distance, knowing that his anger would need time to burn itself out before she could safely be alone with him. She had learned over the years to read the signs of his explosive temper, and she knew that confronting him immediately would only make things worse. But she also knew that she couldn't let him drink himself into complete oblivion. They still had 3 more days on the ship, and she needed to limit the damage he could cause. By the time she reached their cabin on Deck 9, Vincent had already opened the sliding door to their balcony and was standing at the railing with a bottle of whiskey he had apparently stolen from the dining room. The sight of him drinking directly from the bottle while leaning against the safety barrier made Linda's stomach clench with fear. The balcony was 30 feet above the ocean, and Vincent's coordination was severely impaired by alcohol. "Vincent, please come inside," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and non-threatening. "You're scaring me." "Good," he replied without turning around, his words badly slurred, but still audible. "Maybe you should be scared. Maybe you should think about what happens to wives who embarrass their husbands in public." Linda felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that Vincent's anger had turned into something much more dangerous. She had seen him drunk countless times, but there was something different about his demeanor tonight, a reckless desperation that suggested he might be capable of anything. The combination of alcohol, humiliation, and the news that she wanted a divorce had created a perfect storm of rage that threatened to consume them both. "I'm going to call security," she said, backing toward the cabin door. "You need help, Vincent. This has gone too far." But Vincent spun around so quickly that he nearly lost his balance, the whiskey bottle sloshing as he gestured wildly. "You're not calling anyone," he said, his voice rising to a shout. "You created this mess, and you're going to deal with it. You want to humiliate me? Fine. But you're not going to run away and leave me to clean up your mess." What happened next would be debated in legal proceedings for months, but the basic facts were undisputed. Vincent, in his drunken rage, made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Whether it was a genuine suicide attempt, a manipulative gesture designed to frighten Linda, or simply the result of catastrophically impaired judgment, Vincent Kowalski climbed over the balcony railing and let go. Linda's scream echoed across the ship's upper decks as she watched her husband plummet toward the dark ocean below. The fall seemed to take forever, his body spinning through the air like a rag doll before disappearing into the churning water alongside the massive cruise ship. She stood frozen at the railing, unable to process what she had just witnessed, her mind struggling to accept that Vincent had actually jumped. But Vincent Kowalski's story didn't end in the Caribbean waters that night. In what could only be described as a miracle of timing and extraordinary luck, his falling body struck the ship's lifeboat on Deck 4, bouncing off the rubberized surface and landing in the boat's interior instead of continuing into the ocean. The impact knocked him unconscious and broke 3 ribs, but it also saved his life in the most improbable way possible. The ship's medical team found Vincent 40 minutes later, sprawled unconscious in lifeboat number 7 with a blood alcohol level that should have killed him even without the fall. He had somehow managed to survive a 30-foot plunge by landing in the one spot on the side of the ship that could cushion his impact enough to prevent death. The odds of such a landing were astronomically small, leading some crew members to joke that Vincent was either incredibly lucky or too drunk to die. The incident created chaos throughout the ship as passengers and crew members tried to process what had happened. Vincent's fall had been witnessed by dozens of people on the upper decks, and conflicting stories about whether it was suicide, accident, or domestic violence began circulating immediately. The ship's security team launched a full investigation, interviewing witnesses and reviewing security footage to determine exactly what had occurred. Linda found herself in the surreal position of being both relieved that her husband was alive and horrified by the circumstances that had led to his fall. The other passengers looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion, unsure whether she was a victim of domestic violence or somehow complicit in her husband's apparent suicide attempt. The cruise that was supposed to save their marriage had instead become a public spectacle that exposed their deepest problems to thousands of strangers. The medical team worked through the night to stabilize Vincent, treating his injuries and monitoring his vital signs while his body processed the massive amount of alcohol he had consumed. When he finally regained consciousness the next morning, he had no memory of the previous night's events and was shocked to learn that he had jumped from their balcony. The fall had sobered him in more ways than one, and he was forced to confront the reality of his alcoholism and the destruction it had caused. The remaining days of the cruise were a nightmare of legal interviews, medical examinations, and media attention as news of the incident spread beyond the ship. Vincent was confined to the medical bay under psychiatric observation, while Linda struggled to deal with the aftermath of their very public marital crisis. She spent hours giving statements to security personnel and dealing with the constant stares and whispers of other passengers who recognized her from the dining room incident. When the ship finally docked in Miami, Vincent was immediately transferred to a mainland hospital for further treatment and psychological evaluation. The FBI launched an investigation into the incident, trying to determine whether charges should be filed for domestic violence or public endangerment. The cruise line faced questions about their alcohol service policies and their handling of intoxicated passengers who posed a danger to themselves and others. The aftermath of Vincent's fall would follow both of them for years. Linda went through with her divorce, using the cruise incident as evidence of her husband's dangerous behavior and need for intervention. Vincent was ordered to undergo alcohol treatment and anger management counseling, and he was banned from several cruise lines for life. The incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive drinking and domestic violence, but it also served as an unlikely story of survival against impossible odds. The Carnival Breeze continued its regular cruise schedule, but new safety protocols were implemented to prevent similar incidents. Higher railings, improved lighting, and stricter alcohol service policies were designed to protect passengers from their own poor judgment. The ship's crew began receiving additional training on recognizing signs of domestic violence and intervening before the situations escalated to dangerous levels. Vincent's survival became something of a legend among cruise ship employees, who would tell the story of the man who was too drunk to die. But for Linda, the incident represented the end of a 20-year nightmare and the beginning of a new life, free from the fear and humiliation she had endured. The cruise that was supposed to be a second honeymoon had instead become the final chapter of their marriage, played out in the most dramatic and public way possible. Years later, Vincent would maintain that he had no intention of surviving the fall, that his jump was a genuine suicide attempt, motivated by despair and alcohol-induced desperation. But the fact remained that he had chosen to make his gesture in a way that maximized the trauma for his wife and the other passengers who witnessed it. His survival, while miraculous, could not undo the damage he had caused or erase the memory of that night, when a family vacation became a nightmare that would haunt everyone involved. The balcony plunge had become an unintended metaphor for their entire marriage. A reckless leap that should have ended in disaster, but instead resulted in an improbable survival that nobody had wanted or expected. Vincent lived to face the consequences of his actions, But the cost of his survival was measured in broken relationships, shattered trust, and the knowledge that sometimes the most dramatic gestures only serve to reveal the depth of our failures as human beings. In the end, the man who jumped from the balcony in a moment of drunken rage discovered that survival could be its own form of punishment, forcing him to confront the wreckage of his life without the escape he had sought in death. The lifeboat that saved his life became a symbol of the second chance he would spend years trying to earn, one day at a time, in the long journey toward redemption and sobriety. Let's move to our seventh story. The alarm that pierced through the ocean majesty at 2:17 a.m. wasn't the gentle chime that typically announced mealtimes or activity schedules. This was the emergency signal that every crew member dreaded. 3 long blasts followed by 2 short ones, repeated continuously until the entire ship's population of 3,800 passengers and 1,200 crew members was wide awake and filled with dread. Marcus Chen, the ship's head of security, had been hoping he'd never hear that particular sequence during his 15-year career at sea. But tonight, it shattered his peaceful sleep like a sledgehammer through glass. The missing passenger was James Patterson, a 45-year-old businessman from Chicago who had been traveling alone on what his colleagues back home assumed was a well-deserved vacation. James had seemed like any other solo traveler when he'd boarded the ship in Miami 3 days earlier. Quiet, polite, and content to keep to himself while exploring the Caribbean. He'd attended a few of the ship's shows, eaten at the buffet, and spent hours reading on Deck 7's quiet observation lounge. Nothing about his behavior had raised any red flags or suggested that he might be in distress. But James Patterson hadn't been seen since 11:30 p.m., when he'd left the ship's main casino after a modest winning streak at the blackjack table. His cabin steward had noticed that his bed hadn't been slept in when she'd attempted to deliver fresh towels that morning, but initially assumed he'd spent the night elsewhere on the ship. It wasn't until James missed his scheduled shore excursion in Cozumel that the ship's staff began to suspect something was seriously wrong. The search protocol was exhaustive and terrifying in its implications. Every crew member, regardless of their shift schedule or job responsibilities, was roused from their quarters and assigned to search teams. The ship was divided into zones, and each area was methodically combed by groups of flashlight-wielding staff members who checked every possible hiding place, storage area, and restricted space where a passenger might have wandered or collapsed. Marcus Chen coordinated the operation from the ship's security center, a high-tech command post lined with monitors showing feeds from hundreds of security cameras positioned throughout the vessel. The footage from the previous night showed James leaving the casino at 11:32 p.m., walking purposefully toward the elevator bank that served the upper decks. The cameras tracked his movement to Deck 12, where he'd stepped out of the elevator and walked toward the ship's bow area. Then, inexplicably, he disappeared from the surveillance system entirely. The search teams worked with methodical urgency, knowing that every minute could be crucial if James had suffered a medical emergency or accident. They checked every bathroom, every storage closet, every maintenance area that might have been left unlocked. The ship's medical center was searched twice, along with all the restaurants, bars, and entertainment venues. Pool areas were examined with underwater lights, and even the ship's laundry facilities were thoroughly inspected. As the hours passed without any trace of James Patterson, the search expanded to include areas that passengers weren't supposed to be able to access. Crew quarters were opened for inspection, along with mechanical spaces, food storage areas, and the ship's waste management facilities. The search teams moved through the vessel like a coordinated army, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they called James's name and listened for any response. The passengers, meanwhile, were experiencing their own form of terror as they realized that someone had simply vanished from their floating sanctuary. The ship's public address system crackled to life every 30 minutes with updates from the captain. But each announcement only served to heighten the sense of unease that had settled over the vessel like a fog. Families huddled together in their cabins, suddenly aware of how isolated they were in the middle of the ocean. "Has anyone checked the lifeboats?" asked Sarah Martinez, a passenger who had volunteered to help with the search despite not being required to do so. She was part of a group of guests who had been organized into an auxiliary search team, checking public areas while the crew focused on restricted spaces. The lifeboats had indeed been checked, but Marcus Chen ordered a second, more thorough examination of each one. The thought that James might have somehow fallen into one of the emergency craft wasn't entirely impossible, especially if he'd been drinking or had suffered some kind of medical episode. The search teams rappelled down the sides of the ship with specialized equipment, opening each lifeboat and examining every inch of the interior. By 4 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the search had begun, the most terrifying possibility was beginning to seem inevitable. If James Patterson wasn't anywhere on the ship, then he had somehow gone overboard. The Caribbean waters were warm enough that survival was theoretically possible. But the ship had been traveling at 22 knots, and the chances of finding someone in the vast ocean were astronomically small. The Coast Guard was contacted, and within an hour, helicopters and patrol boats were converging on the ship's position to begin an ocean search. The Ocean Majesty was ordered to reverse course and retrace its path from the previous night, creating a search pattern that might locate James if he was still alive in the water. The ship's massive searchlights swept across the ocean surface, creating an apocalyptic scene that passengers would remember for the rest of their lives. As dawn broke over the Caribbean, the search had taken on a desperate quality that was obvious to everyone involved. The passengers who had initially been curious about the commotion were now genuinely frightened, realizing that if James Patterson could simply disappear from a ship carrying thousands of people, then their own safety was far from guaranteed. Children clung to their parents, and elderly passengers spoke in hushed tones about the dangers of ocean travel. The breakthrough came at 6:45 a.m. when a crew member searching the ship's waste management area discovered something that made everyone's blood run cold. James Patterson's wallet and room key were found in a maintenance corridor near the ship's stern, along with his shoes and the jacket he'd been wearing when he'd left the casino. The items were arranged in a neat pile, as if James had deliberately placed them there before doing something that required him to remove them. But James himself was nowhere to be found. The discovery shifted the search from a rescue operation to a potential crime scene investigation. The FBI was contacted via satellite phone, and agents were standing by to board the ship as soon as it reached the next port. The crew members who had found James's belongings were isolated and questioned, and the area where the items were discovered was cordoned off with yellow tape. Marcus Chen found himself dealing with a nightmare scenario that went far beyond a simple missing person case. The presence of James's personal effects suggested either suicide or foul play, and both possibilities created massive liability issues for the cruise line. The ship's passenger manifest was reviewed for anyone who might have had contact with James, and security footage from the previous days was examined frame by frame for any signs of suspicious behavior. The passengers, meanwhile, were experiencing a level of paranoia that transformed their luxury vacation into a floating horror story. If James had been murdered, then the killer was still on board, potentially planning to strike again. Families locked their cabin doors and avoided being alone in public areas. The ship's restaurants and entertainment venues, which had been bustling with activity just hours earlier, now felt like potential crime scenes where danger might be lurking around every corner. The ocean search continued for 3 more days, but no trace of James Patterson was ever found. The Coast Guard eventually called off the operation, concluding that if he had gone overboard, his body had been claimed by the sea. The Ocean Majesty was allowed to complete its cruise, but the atmosphere on board had been permanently altered by the knowledge that one of their fellow passengers had simply vanished without explanation. The investigation that followed would consume months of law enforcement resources and generate thousands of pages of reports. But it never definitively answered the question of what had happened to James Patterson. The security footage showed him walking toward the ship's bow, but the cameras in that area had been experiencing technical difficulties that night, creating a gap in the surveillance record that coincided perfectly with his disappearance. Some passengers theorized that James had committed suicide, overwhelmed by personal problems that no one else knew about. Others insisted that he had been murdered, possibly by someone who had been watching him win money at the casino. The ship's crew developed their own theories, ranging from accidental death to elaborate insurance fraud. But none of them could explain why James's belongings had been found so far from where he was last seen on camera. The case remained officially open, but as the years passed, James Patterson became just another name in the growing list of people who had vanished from cruise ships without explanation. His family hired private investigators and filed lawsuits against the cruise line, but they never found answers that satisfied their need to understand what had happened to their loved one. For the passengers who had been aboard the Ocean Majesty that night, the experience fundamentally changed their perception of cruise ship safety. They had learned that even on a vessel carrying thousands of people, it was possible for someone to simply disappear without a trace. The ocean, they realized, was vast and unforgiving, and the thin shell of civilization that cruise ships represented could be pierced by forces beyond human control. Marcus Chen continued working cruise ship security for 3 more years after the James Patterson incident. But he never forgot the helpless feeling of searching for someone who had vanished into thin air. The case taught him that despite all the cameras, all the safety protocols, and all the crew training, cruise ships remained vulnerable to the fundamental mystery of human behavior and the unforgiving nature of the sea. The Ocean Majesty continued its regular cruise schedule, but new safety measures were implemented in response to the Patterson disappearance. Additional cameras were installed, security patrols were increased, and passengers were given more information about the dangers of being alone on deck during nighttime hours. But these changes couldn't address the deeper truth that the incident had revealed: that in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by thousands of people, it was still possible to be completely and utterly alone. The mystery of James Patterson's disappearance would never be solved, but it served as a reminder that cruise ships, despite their reputation as floating paradises, could become settings for the darkest human experiences. The man who had walked toward the ship's bow that night had taken his secrets with him into whatever fate awaited him, leaving behind only questions that would haunt everyone who had known him, searched for him, or simply shared a ship with him during his final hours. In the end, the ocean had claimed another victim, and the survivors were left to wonder whether they would ever feel truly safe again, while floating on the endless expanse of water that could swallow a human being without leaving so much as a ripple on the surface. The search for James Patterson had ended, but the fear he had left behind would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed his disappearance. A reminder that some mysteries are too dark to ever be fully understood. Let's move to our 8th story. The celebrity eclipse was known for its sophisticated clientele and refined atmosphere, attracting passengers who valued elegance and discretion during their Caribbean vacation. The ship's marketing materials emphasized the elevated experience they provided. Fine dining, cultural enrichment programs, and an ambiance that set them apart from the party-focused vessels that dominated the cruise industry. What happened on the night of March 15th would forever shatter that carefully cultivated image and traumatize dozens of passengers who had expected nothing more dangerous than a quiet evening stroll through the ship's pristine corridors. The trouble began in the ship's premium sports bar, where a group of college friends were celebrating their spring break with increasingly reckless abandon. Among them was someone who would later be identified only as Passenger X in the ship's incident reports. A 22-year-old whose name was sealed by legal proceedings, but whose actions would become the stuff of nightmares for everyone who witnessed them. He had been drinking steadily since the ship departed Fort Lauderdale, consuming a lethal combination of beer, shots, and tropical cocktails that would have incapacitated most people hours earlier. By 10:30 p.m., Passenger X had reached a level of intoxication that transcended normal drunkenness and entered the realm of alcohol poisoning. His speech was completely incoherent. He had lost control of his motor functions, and his inhibitions had vanished entirely. The ship's bartenders had cut him off hours earlier, but his friends had continued supplying him with drinks, treating his deteriorating condition as entertainment, rather than recognizing the medical emergency that was developing. The first sign of trouble came when Passenger X began vomiting violently in the sports bar. Projectile vomiting that splattered across tables, chairs, and other patrons. The smell was overwhelming. A mixture of alcohol, partially digested food, and stomach acid that immediately cleared the immediate area. But instead of seeking help or taking their friend to the medical center, his companion simply moved him to a different location, treating the incident as a minor inconvenience rather than a warning sign. What happened next would haunt the passengers and crew members who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Passenger X stumbled out of the sports bar and began wandering the ship's corridors, his condition deteriorating rapidly. The combination of extreme intoxication and what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown created a perfect storm of chaos that would transform a quiet evening into a nightmare that no one could have anticipated. The rampage began on Deck 7, near the ship's main shopping area, where families were browsing for souvenirs and elderly couples were enjoying after-dinner walks. Passenger X appeared suddenly, completely naked and covered in his own vomit and feces, stumbling through the corridor like a zombie from a horror movie. The sight was so shocking and unexpected that most people initially froze, unable to process what they were seeing. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez was holding her mother's hand when the naked, defecating man appeared around the corner. The child's screams echoed through the corridor as she witnessed something that would require years of therapy to overcome. Her mother, Isabella, tried to shield her daughter's eyes, but the damage was already done. The image of the wild-eyed, filth-covered man stumbling toward them was burned into the little girl's memory forever. The smell that accompanied Passenger X was indescribable. A combination of human waste, vomit, and the sour stench of someone who had lost all bodily control. Passengers fled in all directions, some running toward the elevators, others pressing themselves against the walls in a desperate attempt to avoid contact with the stumbling, naked figure. The elegant corridor that had been filled with the gentle murmur of civilized conversation was suddenly echoing with screams of terror and disgust. Passenger X seemed oblivious to the chaos he was creating, stumbling forward with the single-minded determination of someone whose higher brain functions had been completely compromised by alcohol and whatever psychological breakdown he was experiencing. As he moved through the ship, he left a trail of bodily fluids that created a biohazard situation requiring immediate professional cleanup. The ship's housekeeping staff, who had signed up to change sheets and clean bathrooms, suddenly found themselves dealing with a toxic waste scenario that hadn't been covered in their training. The ship's security team responded as quickly as they could, but the narrow corridors and crowds of panicked passengers made it difficult to reach the source of the disturbance. By the time they arrived on Deck 7, Passenger X had moved on, leaving behind a scene of devastation that looked like something from a disaster movie. Traumatized passengers were huddled in doorways, children were crying, and the smell of human waste permeated the air despite the ship's powerful ventilation system. The chase continued through multiple decks as Passenger X's rampage took him into the ship's most public areas. He stumbled through the main atrium, where a string quartet had been performing classical music for guests enjoying after-dinner drinks. The elegant scene was shattered as the naked, defecating man appeared at the top of the grand staircase. His appearance so shocking that several passengers nearly fell down the stairs in their haste to escape. The ship's medical team was finally able to intercept Passenger X near the main dining room. But subduing him required multiple crew members and created an even more disturbing scene. His resistance was violent and irrational, and the struggle resulted in even more bodily fluids being spread across the ship's common areas. The medical staff had to treat him like a biohazard, using protective equipment normally reserved for infectious disease outbreaks. The aftermath of the incident was almost as traumatic as the rampage itself. The ship's housekeeping staff worked through the night to decontaminate affected areas, using industrial-grade cleaning supplies and specialized equipment to remove the biological contamination. Carpets had to be replaced, furniture had to be professionally cleaned, and the ship's ventilation system had to be purged to eliminate the lingering odors. The psychological impact on the passengers was severe and long-lasting. The Rodriguez family, whose 8-year-old daughter had witnessed the beginning of the rampage, immediately disembarked at the next port and flew home. Their vacation ruined by an experience that no child should ever have to endure. Isabella Rodriguez later sued the cruise line for psychological trauma, arguing that they had failed to protect her family from a clearly dangerous situation. Other passengers experienced similar trauma, particularly those who had been in enclosed spaces when Passenger X appeared. The ship's elevators, which had been used by the fleeing passengers, had to be shut down for extensive cleaning after multiple people vomited in response to the overwhelming sensory assault. The elegant dining venues and shopping areas that had been the ship's pride became associated with horror and disgust. The cruise line faced immediate legal action from multiple passengers who argued that the incident could have been prevented if the ship's staff had properly monitored alcohol consumption and intervened when Passenger X showed signs of dangerous intoxication. The bartenders who had served him were questioned extensively, and security footage revealed that his condition had been deteriorating visibly for hours before the rampage began. The incident also exposed serious gaps in the ship's emergency response protocols. The security team had been trained to handle fights, theft, and medical emergencies, but they had no procedures for dealing with someone who was simultaneously a medical emergency, a biohazard, and a public safety threat. The crew members who responded to the scene had no protective equipment and were potentially exposed to dangerous pathogens. Passenger X was confined to the ship's medical facility for the remainder of the cruise, under constant supervision and sedation. His friends, who had enabled his dangerous level of intoxication, were also confined to their cabins and faced potential criminal charges for their role in the incident. The investigation revealed that they had been supplying him with alcohol long after he should have been hospitalized, treating his deteriorating condition as entertainment rather than recognizing the medical emergency that was developing. The Celebrity Eclipse completed its cruise, But the atmosphere on board had been permanently altered by the knowledge that their floating sanctuary could become a scene of such degradation and horror. Passengers who had booked the cruise for its sophisticated ambiance found themselves dealing with a situation that belonged in a mental hospital rather than a luxury vacation. The incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive alcohol consumption and the importance of recognizing when someone needs immediate medical intervention. The legal proceedings that followed lasted for years, with multiple lawsuits filed by passengers who had been traumatized by the experience. The cruise line eventually settled most of the claims out of court, paying substantial damages while implementing new policies for monitoring alcohol consumption and responding to medical emergencies. The incident led to industry-wide changes in how cruise ships handle intoxicated passengers and the training provided to staff members who might encounter similar situations. For the passengers who witnessed Passenger X's rampage, the experience served as a brutal reminder that even in the most civilized environments, human behavior can descend into chaos with frightening speed. The image of the naked, defecating man stumbling through the ship's elegant corridors would haunt them for years, a reminder that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than most people realize. The incident also highlighted the vulnerability of children in environments where adults are expected to behave responsibly. Emma Rodriguez's trauma was particularly severe because she had been exposed to something that no child should ever witness, and her recovery required extensive therapy and counseling. The cruise that was supposed to be a family vacation became a defining moment in her young life, creating fears and anxieties that would take years to overcome. The ship's crew members who responded to the incident also suffered psychological trauma, particularly those who had to physically restrain Passenger X and clean up the biological contamination he had left behind. Many of them required counseling and medical treatment, and several left the cruise industry entirely, unable to continue working in an environment where such incidents were possible. The Celebrity Eclipse continued its regular cruise schedule, but new safety protocols were implemented to prevent similar incidents. Stricter alcohol service policies, enhanced medical monitoring, and improved emergency response procedures were designed to protect passengers from encountering similar situations. The ship's elegant corridors were restored to their former beauty, but the memory of what had happened there would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The incident became a case study in crisis management and passenger safety, used by the cruise industry to train staff members and develop better protocols for handling extreme situations. But for those who had experienced it firsthand, no amount of training or preparation could erase the memory of that night, when their luxury cruise became a nightmare of human degradation and biological contamination. In the end, the naked rampage served as a reminder that even the most carefully controlled environments can be disrupted by human behavior that defies rational explanation. The passengers who had booked the Celebrity Eclipse for its sophisticated ambiance learned that elegance and refinement are fragile things that can be shattered in an instant by someone who has lost all connection to civilized behavior. The incident would forever change how they viewed cruise ship safety and the importance of maintaining standards that protect everyone from the chaos that can emerge when human nature is stripped of its civilizing influences. Let's move to our ninth story. Captain Morrison had been sailing cruise ships for 32 years, and he thought he had seen everything the ocean could throw at him. Storms that could crack steel, medical emergencies that would challenge the finest hospitals, and mechanical failures that tested every ounce of his seamanship. But nothing in his decades of maritime experience had prepared him for what happened aboard the Mystique of the Seas during a seemingly routine Caribbean cruise that would forever change his understanding of what was possible on the open ocean. The Mystique of the Seas was a mid-sized vessel carrying 2,400 passengers, known for its themed cruises that attracted guests with specific interests. This particular voyage was marketed as a paranormal investigation cruise, featuring lectures on ghost hunting, psychic phenomena, and supernatural experiences. Captain Morrison had initially been skeptical of the theme, viewing it as harmless entertainment for guests who enjoyed scary stories and mysterious legends. He never imagined that the paranormal activities would extend beyond the scheduled programming. The trouble began on the third night of the cruise, when a group of off-duty crew members decided to conduct their own seance in the ship's employee recreation area. Led by Marina Volkov, a 28-year-old entertainment coordinator from Russia. The group had been inspired by the passenger activities and wanted to experience their own supernatural adventure. Marina had studied folklore and mythology in college, and she convinced her colleagues that their seance would be a harmless way to pass the time during their off-duty hours. The seance took place in a small storage room that had been converted into a break area for the entertainment staff. Marina had arranged candles around a makeshift Ouija board, and 6 crew members sat in a circle, their hands placed lightly on the planchette as they attempted to contact the spirits of deceased passengers. The atmosphere was initially light-hearted, with participants joking and laughing as they asked questions about their love lives and career prospects. "Is there anyone here who wants to speak with us?" Marina asked, her voice taking on a theatrical quality as she played the role of medium. The planchette remained motionless for several minutes, and the group began to lose interest in the experiment. But then, slowly and deliberately, the small triangular piece began to move across the board, spelling out a message that would chill everyone in the room. HELPUS. The crew members looked at each other nervously, each denying that they had moved the planchette. Marina felt a cold chill run down her spine as she realized that none of them seemed to be controlling the board's movements. The candles flickered despite the absence of any breeze, and the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees in the span of seconds. "Who are you?" Marina asked, her voice now genuinely frightened rather than playfully dramatic. The response came quickly, the planchette moving with increasing urgency across the board. WEARETHEFORGOTTEN. The seance participants sat in stunned silence as the implications of the message sank in. The ship's records showed that 17 passengers had died during various cruises over the past decade. Their deaths attributed to natural causes, accidents, or suicides. The crew members had heard whispered stories about these incidents, but they had never considered that the spirits of the deceased might still be present on the vessel. The planchette continued moving, spelling out names that some of the crew members recognized from incident reports and memorial services. Robert Chen, the passenger who had died of a heart attack and whose body had been mishandled by the ship's crew. Sarah Martinez, who had survived the infamous poop cruise, but had died of a stress-related condition months later. Emma Thompson, who had experienced paranormal phenomena in cabin 7B and had never fully recovered from the trauma. Marina tried to end the seance, but the spirits seemed reluctant to let them go. The planchette moved frantically across the board, spelling out pleas for help and messages of desperation that left the crew members shaken and confused. The candles began to flicker more violently, and several participants reported feeling invisible hands touching their shoulders and arms. "We need to stop this," whispered Carlos, the ship's assistant cruise director, his voice barely audible above the sound of the ship's engines. "This is getting too real." But when Marina tried to lift her hands from the planchette, she found that she couldn't move them. An invisible force seemed to be holding her fingers in place, and the other participants reported similar experiences. They were trapped in the seance, unable to break the connection they had established with whatever entities were communicating through the board. The messages became more coherent and specific, with the spirits describing details about their deaths that had never been made public. They spoke of cover-ups, negligence, and deliberate concealment of evidence that would have revealed the true circumstances of their passing. The crew members found themselves learning about incidents that had been classified and sealed, information that should have been impossible for them to access. Then the physical manifestations began. The storage room's lights began flickering in patterns that seemed to correspond to the messages on the Ouija board. Objects moved on their own, and the crew members heard voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize. The temperature continued to drop until their breath became visible in the air, and frost began forming on the metal surfaces around them. Captain Morrison first learned about the seance when Marina's supervisor reported that the entertainment staff had failed to report for their evening duties. A search of the crew areas led to the discovery of the 6 participants, still seated around their makeshift Ouija board, apparently unable to move or speak. The ship's medical team was called immediately, but they found no physical explanation for the crew members' condition. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the ship's chief medical officer, was baffled by what she observed. The crew members appeared to be in some kind of trance state. Their vital signs stable, but their responses minimal. They seemed to be aware of their surroundings, but unable to break their connection to the seance board. Most disturbing of all, the room's temperature was at least 20 degrees colder than the surrounding areas, despite the ship's heating system functioning normally. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Harper reported to Captain Morrison over the ship's internal communication system. "They're not unconscious, but they're not fully responsive either. It's as if they're communicating with something we can't see or hear." Captain Morrison made the decision to involve the ship's chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, who had experience with counseling passengers who claimed to have had supernatural experiences. Father O'Brien arrived at the storage room carrying a Bible and holy water, prepared to perform whatever rituals might be necessary to break the supernatural connection. The moment Father O'Brien entered the room, the paranormal activity intensified dramatically. The candles were extinguished by an invisible force, and the Ouija board began moving on its own, spelling out messages so rapidly that it was difficult to follow. The crew members began speaking in unison, their voices taking on different accents and inflections as they channeled the spirits of the deceased passengers. "We were murdered," Marina said, her voice now carrying a distinctive Norwegian accent that belonged to Astrid Larsen, the marine biologist who had died months after her encounter with the ghosts in cabin 7B. "The cruise line covered up our deaths to protect their reputation." The other crew members began speaking as well, each channeling a different deceased passenger and revealing details about their deaths that had never been made public. They described medical negligence, safety violations, and deliberate concealment of evidence that painted a picture of systematic corruption within the cruise industry. Father O'Brien began reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water around the room. But the spiritual activity only seemed to intensify. The spirits were determined to tell their stories, and they had found willing vessels in the crew members who had opened themselves to supernatural communication. The seance had become a conduit for the dead to speak to the living, and they would not be silenced. The breakthrough came when Captain Morrison made a decision that would forever change his career and his understanding of his responsibilities as a ship's captain. Instead of trying to end the seance, he decided to listen to what the spirits were trying to tell him. He entered the storage room and addressed the entities directly, promising to investigate their claims and ensure that their stories would be heard. The moment Captain Morrison made his promise, the supernatural activity began to subside. The crew members gradually regained their ability to move and speak normally, and the room's temperature returned to normal. The Ouija board fell silent, and the overwhelming sense of presence that had filled the space slowly dissipated. But the aftermath of the séance was far from over. The crew members who had participated in the ritual were forever changed by their experience, and several of them left the cruise industry entirely, unable to continue working in an environment where they now knew the dead could still make their presence known. Marina Volkov became obsessed with investigating the deaths of passengers on cruise ships, eventually leaving her job to become a paranormal investigator, specializing in maritime mysteries. Captain Morrison kept his promise to the spirits, launching a private investigation into the passenger deaths that had been mentioned during the séance. What he discovered confirmed many of the spirits' claims. Medical records had been falsified, safety violations had been covered up, and several deaths that had been classified as natural causes or accidents showed signs of negligence or worse. The investigation led to congressional hearings, regulatory changes, and massive legal settlements for the families of deceased passengers. Captain Morrison's career was effectively ended by his decision to pursue the truth. But he never regretted his choice to listen to the voices of the dead. The séance had given him a responsibility that transcended his obligations to his employer, and he spent the rest of his life working to ensure that the deaths of cruise ship passengers would never again be covered up or ignored. The mystique of the seas continued its regular cruise schedule, but the paranormal activity didn't end with the séance. Passengers and crew members began reporting strange occurrences throughout the ship. Voices in empty corridors, unexplained cold spots, and the appearance of figures that seemed to be trying to communicate with the living. The ship's reputation for supernatural activity eventually led to its retirement from regular cruise service and its conversion into a floating museum dedicated to maritime mysteries. The séance had opened a door between the world of the living and the dead, and that door could never be completely closed. The spirits of the forgotten passengers had found their voice, and they would continue to make their presence known to anyone who was willing to listen. The cruise industry would never be the same after Captain Morrison's investigation revealed the truth about how passenger deaths were handled, and the regulatory changes that followed would save countless lives in the years to come. For Marina Volkov and the other crew members who had participated in the séance, the experience became a defining moment that changed their understanding of life, death, and the responsibilities we have to both the living and the dead. They had learned that some secrets are too important to remain buried, and that sometimes the most powerful voices are those that speak from beyond the grave. The Phantom Séance had become a beacon for the spirits of those who had been forgotten, ignored, or deliberately silenced. Their messages of warning and revelation would echo through the cruise industry for years to come, ensuring that their deaths would not be in vain and that future passengers would be better protected from the dangers that had claimed their lives. In the end, the séance had accomplished what years of investigations and lawsuits had failed to achieve. It had given the dead a voice that could not be silenced, and it had created a legacy of truth that would protect generations of future cruise passengers from suffering the same fate. The spirits had found their peace, but their message would live on in the improved safety standards and increased accountability that followed their supernatural revelations. The ocean had always been a place of mystery and danger, but the Phantom Séance had revealed that even in death, the victims of maritime negligence could still fight for justice. Their voices had been heard, their stories had been told, and their sacrifice had made the seas safer for all who would follow in their wake. Let's move to our 10th story. The Carnival Triumph had been dead in the water for 3 days when the thin veneer of civilized behavior finally began to crack. What had started as an inconvenience, a minor engine fire that knocked out power to the massive cruise ship, had evolved into something much more sinister as 4,000 passengers and crew members found themselves trapped in a floating prison with dwindling supplies and failing sanitation systems. The ship that had promised endless buffets and luxury dining was now rationing food like a disaster zone. And the psychological pressure was beginning to transform ordinary vacationers into desperate survivors willing to fight for basic necessities. Maria Santos had been looking forward to this cruise for months. The 34-year-old teacher from Phoenix had saved every penny to afford this Caribbean vacation with her 2 teenage sons, Miguel and Carlos. It was supposed to be a celebration of her divorce finally being finalized and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Instead, she found herself standing in line for the 3rd day in a row, waiting for whatever meager rations the crew could distribute from their emergency supplies. The food situation had deteriorated rapidly after the ship's refrigeration systems failed. What had once been elaborate buffets featuring fresh seafood, prime rib, and gourmet desserts was now reduced to peanut butter sandwiches, crackers, and warm soda. The ship's massive dining rooms, designed to accommodate thousands of passengers simultaneously, had been transformed into distribution centers where crew members handed out pre-packaged meals like aid workers in a refugee camp. But it was the psychological transformation of the passengers that truly horrified Maria. These were people who had paid thousands of dollars for a luxury experience, accustomed to having their every need catered to by smiling staff members. Now they were fighting over packages of stale cookies and arguing about fair distribution of bottled water. The desperation in their eyes was something Maria had never seen before. The look of people who had suddenly realized that their comfortable assumptions about safety and abundance could be shattered in an instant. The breaking point came during the evening meal distribution on Deck 12. Maria had been waiting in line for over 2 hours with her sons, watching as the available food supplies dwindled and the crowd grew increasingly restless. The ship's crew, exhausted from days of crisis management, were struggling to maintain order as hundreds of hungry passengers pressed forward, demanding their share of the limited provisions. "There's not enough food," whispered an elderly woman behind Maria, her voice cracking with fear. "They're going to run out before we get to the front of the line." The rumors spread through the crowd like wildfire, creating a wave of panic that rippled through the assembled passengers. People began pushing forward, abandoning the orderly queue system that had maintained some semblance of civilization. Maria felt herself being shoved from behind as desperate passengers tried to get closer to the distribution tables, their polite vacation demeanor replaced by the raw instinct for survival. The first fight broke out near the front of the line, when a middle-aged man named Robert Kim tried to take 2 meal packages instead of 1. The crew member monitoring the distribution tried to stop him, but Robert's wife immediately intervened, screaming that they had been shortchanged the previous day and deserved extra rations. Within seconds, other passengers joined the argument, some supporting the couple's claim and others demanding that everyone follow the rationing rules. "We paid for this cruise," Robert's wife shrieked, her voice carrying across the deck and attracting the attention of everyone in the vicinity. "We deserve the same food as everyone else. Our money is just as good as theirs." The crew member, a young woman named Lisa from the Philippines, who had been working 18-hour days since the crisis began, tried to maintain her composure as she explained the rationing system. But her reasonable explanations were drowned out by the increasingly aggressive crowd, and Maria could see the fear in the young woman's eyes as she realized that the situation was spinning beyond her control. The violence erupted suddenly and without warning. A large man in his 50s, apparently emboldened by the chaos, simply pushed past the crew member and began grabbing armfuls of food packages. Other passengers saw his actions and immediately followed suit, abandoning any pretense of order as they rushed the distribution tables. The crew members, vastly outnumbered and untrained for riot control, were powerless to stop the stampede. Maria watched in horror as the crowd transformed into a mob, with passengers fighting over packages of crackers and bottles of water as if they were precious treasures. An elderly couple was knocked to the ground by younger passengers who trampled over them in their rush to secure food. Children were crying as their parents pushed them forward, using their small size to squeeze through gaps in the crowd. The primal nature of the behavior was what shocked Maria most. These weren't refugees fleeing a war zone or survivors of a natural disaster. They were middle-class Americans who had been on vacation just days earlier. But the breakdown of normal systems had triggered something deep in their psyche, a survival instinct that overrode years of social conditioning and civilized behavior. "Stay close to me," Maria told her sons, grabbing their arms and trying to navigate through the chaos without getting caught up in the violence. But the crowd was dense and unpredictable, with people pushing in all directions as they fought for position near the remaining food supplies. The scene became increasingly disturbing as passengers began hoarding whatever they could grab, stuffing their pockets and bags with far more than they could possibly consume. A well-dressed woman in her 60s was clutching a dozen packages of peanut butter crackers, her eyes wild with panic as she protected her stash from other passengers. A group of college students had formed a human chain, passing supplies back to a growing pile they were guarding jealously. But it was the families with children who suffered the most. Parents who had been unable to secure adequate food for their kids became increasingly desperate, begging other passengers to share their supplies or trying to trade jewelry and electronics for extra rations. Maria saw a mother offering her wedding ring to another passenger in exchange for a package of cookies for her hungry toddler, a transaction that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The ship's security team finally arrived, but they were ill-equipped to handle a full-scale riot involving hundreds of passengers. Their attempts to restore order only made the situation worse, as people began to panic about being cut off from the remaining food supplies. The crowd surged forward with renewed desperation, and several passengers were injured in the crush of bodies. Maria found herself separated from her sons in the chaos, desperately searching for them while trying to avoid being trampled by the panicking crowd. The rational part of her mind understood that this was a temporary crisis, that rescue would come and normal life would resume. But the primitive part of her brain was screaming that she needed to secure food for her children, that their survival depended on her ability to compete with the other desperate parents around her. When she finally located Miguel and Carlos, they were pressed against a wall, their faces pale with fear as they watched the adults around them behave like animals. The sight of her terrified sons snapped Maria back to reality, reminding her that protecting them meant more than just securing food. It meant maintaining their faith in human decency and civilization. "We're going back to our room," she told them firmly, taking their hands and leading them away from the chaos. "This isn't worth it. We'll find another way to get food." But leaving the distribution area meant accepting that they might go hungry, a decision that required tremendous psychological strength in the face of uncertainty, about when normal conditions would resume. As they walked through the ship's corridors, Mariah could hear the continuing sounds of conflict from the deck above. Shouting, crying, and the crash of overturned furniture as the food riot continued. The aftermath of the riot was almost as traumatic as the event itself. The ship's crew, overwhelmed by the breakdown in order, implemented martial law-style restrictions on a passenger movement and food distribution. Armed security guards were posted at all meal distributions, and passengers were required to present identification and submit to searches before receiving their rations. The psychological damage was severe and long-lasting. Passengers who had fought over food found themselves unable to look at each other without shame and embarrassment. Families that had been friends just days earlier were now suspicious of each other, wondering who might take their food if another crisis arose. The trust that had made the cruise experience possible had been shattered, replaced by a wariness that would persist long after they returned to dry land. Children were particularly affected by witnessing the breakdown of adult behavior. Many of them had never seen their parents or other adults act with such desperation and aggression, and the experience challenged their fundamental assumptions about safety and security. Some required counseling for months after the cruise, struggling to process what they had witnessed during those terrifying hours. The food fight had revealed something disturbing about human nature, that even in relatively minor crises, the veneer of civilization can disappear with shocking speed. The passengers who had fought over crackers and water were not inherently evil people. They were ordinary individuals who had been pushed beyond their psychological breaking point by circumstances beyond their control. Maria and her sons eventually made it home safely, but the experience forever changed their understanding of human nature and social stability. They had learned that the comfortable assumptions of modern life, that food would always be available, that order would be maintained, that adults would behave responsibly, were far more fragile than they had ever imagined. The Carnival Triumph was eventually rescued and returned to service, but the incident led to significant changes in emergency protocols and passenger management procedures. The cruise industry was forced to confront the reality that their passengers, when pushed to extremes, could become as dangerous as any external threat they might face at sea. The food fight panic had lasted only a few hours, but its psychological impact would linger for years in the memories of those who had witnessed it. They had seen civilized people transform into desperate animals, and they had learned that the distance between order and chaos was much shorter than anyone wanted to believe. The cruise that was supposed to be a relaxing vacation had become a lesson in the fragility of human society and the primal instincts that lurk beneath our civilized exterior. In the end, the most disturbing aspect of the food fight wasn't the violence or the desperation. It was the speed with which ordinary people had abandoned their moral principles in the face of adversity. The passengers who had fought over food would eventually return to their normal lives, but they would carry with them the knowledge that they were capable of behavior they had never imagined possible. The ocean had tested them in ways they had never expected, and not all of them had passed the test with their humanity intact. Let's move to our final story. Isabella Rodriguez had always been a careful traveler. The 42-year-old accountant from San Antonio prided herself on meticulous planning and attention to detail, qualities that had served her well in both her professional and personal life. When she booked her solo cruise aboard the Royal Caribbean Voyager for a much-needed break from her demanding job, she had researched every aspect of the voyage, from the ship's safety record to the security measures in place to protect passengers and their belongings. The Royal Caribbean Voyager was a massive vessel carrying over 4,000 passengers, renowned for its comprehensive security systems and professional crew. Isabella had specifically chosen this cruise line because of their reputation for maintaining high standards of safety and guest protection. She had read the security briefings, stored her valuables in the cabin's safe, and followed all the recommended precautions for solo travelers. What she hadn't anticipated was that the greatest threat to her peace of mind would come from someone she had been trained to trust implicitly. Carlos Mendoza had been working as a cabin steward on cruise ships for 7 years, building what appeared to be an exemplary record of service. The 31-year-old from Honduras was known among his colleagues for his friendly demeanor and willingness to go above and beyond for passengers. His personnel file was filled with commendations from grateful guests who praised his attention to detail and helpful attitude. What his supervisors didn't know was that Carlos had developed a sophisticated system for identifying and targeting vulnerable passengers, particularly solo travelers who carried valuable items and appeared to have significant disposable income. Isabella first met Carlos on her second day aboard the ship, when he knocked on her cabin door to introduce himself and offer assistance with anything she might need during her voyage. His smile was warm and genuine, and his English, while accented, was clear and professional. He explained the ship's services, recommended restaurants and activities, and even offered to help her navigate the ship's complex layout. Isabella was impressed by his thoroughness and attention to detail, exactly the kind of service she had expected from a premium cruise line. "If you need anything at all, Miss Rodriguez," Carlos said, his voice carrying a note of sincere concern, "please don't hesitate to ask. I want to make sure your vacation is perfect." Over the next few days, Carlos proved to be as helpful as he had promised. He arranged for fresh flowers to be delivered to Isabella's cabin, secured hard-to-get reservations at the ship's specialty restaurants, and even helped her get premium seating for the evening shows. Isabella found herself looking forward to his daily visits, grateful for the personal attention that made her feel valued as a guest. She began to tip him generously, and she shared stories about her work, her travels, and her life back home. What Isabella didn't realize was that Carlos was conducting a careful assessment of her financial situation and travel patterns. He noted the expensive jewelry she wore, the designer luggage in her cabin, and the casual way she mentioned her successful accounting practice. He observed her daily routines, learning when she attended activities, when she went to meals, and when she was most likely to be away from her cabin for extended periods. Most importantly, he watched her interactions with the cabin's safe, noting the combination she used and the items she considered valuable enough to secure. The theft occurred on the 5th day of the cruise, during the ship's visit to Cozumel. Isabella had joined a shore excursion to explore Mayan ruins, an all-day trip that Carlos knew would keep her away from the ship for at least 8 hours. Using his master key and his knowledge of the ship's security protocols, he entered her cabin during the mid-morning hours when most passengers were either on shore excursions or attending activities on the upper decks. Carlos's method was sophisticated and carefully planned. He didn't simply ransack the cabin like a common burglar. Instead, he methodically searched through Isabella's belongings, looking for items that would be valuable, but not immediately missed. He avoided obvious targets like jewelry that Isabella wore regularly, focusing instead on backup items, cash reserves, and electronics that might not be used daily. He opened her cabin safe using the combination he had memorized, and he selected items that could be easily concealed and transported off the ship. But Carlos made a critical error that would ultimately lead to his exposure. In his confidence and familiarity with the ship's systems, he became careless about covering his tracks. He left subtle signs of his presence. Items slightly out of place, drawers not quite closed properly, and most damaging of all, fingerprints on surfaces that should have been clean. He also underestimated Isabella's attention to detail and her systematic approach to organizing her belongings. Isabella discovered the theft almost immediately upon returning to her cabin that evening. Her accountant's mind was trained to notice discrepancies, and she quickly realized that several items were missing from her safe, including $2,800 in cash, a backup credit card, and a pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. The robbery was professional enough that someone less observant might not have noticed for days, but Isabella's methodical nature meant that she knew exactly what should have been in her possession. The initial response from the ship's security team was disappointing and frustrating. When Isabella reported the theft, she was treated with barely concealed skepticism, as if she might have simply misplaced her belongings or forgotten where she had stored them. The security officer who took her statement seemed more interested in suggesting that she had been careless with her valuables than in investigating the possibility that a crime had occurred. "Are you absolutely certain these items were in your safe?" the security officer asked, his tone suggesting that he doubted her story. Sometimes passengers think they've secured items, but actually left them elsewhere in the cabin. Isabella's frustration was compounded by the realization that she was trapped on the ship with her thief, unable to seek help from outside law enforcement or escape the situation. The ship's security protocols were designed to protect the cruise line's reputation rather than to pursue justice for individual passengers. And she quickly understood that she would receive little help from the crew in recovering her stolen property. But Isabella was not the type of person to accept defeat easily. Using her professional skills and analytical mind, she began conducting her own investigation. She reviewed her interactions with crew members, analyzed who had access to her cabin, and thought carefully about who might have observed her using the safe. Carlos's name quickly rose to the top of her list of suspects, but she knew that accusations without proof would be dismissed by the ship's security team. The breakthrough came when Isabella remembered that Carlos had been in her cabin the previous morning when she had retrieved items from her safe. She had been so comfortable with his presence that she hadn't thought to shield the safe's combination from his view. More importantly, she recalled that he had been unusually interested in her shore excursion plans, asking detailed questions about her itinerary and the duration of her trip. Isabella's investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that pointed clearly to Carlos as the perpetrator. She discovered that he had been asking other passengers about their excursion plans, always in a friendly, helpful manner that disguised his true intentions. She also learned that he had been working extra shifts, volunteering to cover for other stewards in a way that gave him access to cabins throughout the ship. The confrontation came on the final night of the cruise, when Isabella decided to force the issue by directly accusing Carlos of the theft. She had prepared carefully for this moment, gathering evidence and planning her approach to maximize the chances of getting him to admit his guilt. When Carlos arrived for his final check-in, Isabella was ready. "I know you took my things," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I know you watched me use the safe combination, and I know you had access to my cabin during the shore excursion. I want my belongings back." Carlos's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of expressing shock or confusion, he became defensive and angry, his carefully maintained professional demeanor cracking under pressure. He denied the accusations, but his body language and emotional response suggested guilt rather than innocence. Most damaging of all, he made the mistake of providing too many details about his whereabouts during the time of the theft. details that Isabella had not requested, and that suggested he had been thinking about alibis. "You can't prove anything," Carlos said, his voice now cold and threatening. "It's your word against mine, and I have 7 years of excellent service records. Who do you think they'll believe?" But Carlos had underestimated both Isabella's determination and the ship's security systems. When Isabella reported the confrontation to the ship's security team, they were finally motivated to conduct a thorough investigation. A search of Carlos's cabin revealed several items that had been reported stolen by other passengers, along with a notebook containing detailed observations about passenger behavior and cabin security measures. The investigation revealed that Carlos had been operating a sophisticated theft ring for months, targeting solo travelers and passengers who appeared to have significant wealth. He had stolen thousands of dollars in cash, jewelry, and electronics, selling items at ports of call and building a network of contacts who helped him dispose of stolen goods. Isabella's case was just the latest in a series of thefts that had been attributed to passenger carelessness rather than criminal activity. Carlos was arrested when the ship docked in Miami, and he was charged with multiple counts of theft and fraud. The investigation revealed that he had been working with accomplices both on and off the ship, creating a criminal enterprise that had been operating under the cruise line's noses for years. His arrest led to a broader investigation that uncovered systemic security failures and inadequate background checking procedures. For Isabella, the resolution was bittersweet. She recovered some of her stolen items, but the experience had fundamentally changed her relationship with travel and her trust in service providers. The cruise that was supposed to be a relaxing break from her stressful work life had become a lesson in the vulnerability of travelers and the importance of remaining vigilant, even in seemingly safe environments. The aftermath of the Carlos Mendoza case led to significant changes in cruise industry security protocols. Background checks for crew members were strengthened, cabin access procedures were revised, and passenger education programs were implemented to help travelers protect themselves from theft. But for Isabella and the other victims, these changes came too late to prevent the trauma and financial losses they had endured. The case also highlighted the complex legal challenges involved in prosecuting crimes that occur on cruise ships. The international nature of cruise operations, combined with the jurisdictional issues that arise when crimes occur in international waters, creates obstacles that can prevent justice from being served. Isabella's persistence and analytical skills had been crucial in bringing Carlos to justice. But many other victims might not have had the resources or determination to pursue their cases. Years later, Isabella would reflect on the experience as a turning point in her understanding of personal security and the importance of trusting her instincts. She had learned that predators often hide behind positions of trust and authority, and that vigilance must be maintained even in environments that appear safe and controlled. The cruise industry had marketed itself as a secure, worry-free vacation experience. But Isabella's experience revealed the darker reality that criminals could exploit the very systems designed to protect passengers. The phantom thief had been caught, but the damage he had caused would linger in the memories of his victims for years to come. Isabella never took another cruise, choosing instead to travel in ways that gave her more control over her environment and security. She became an advocate for stronger passenger protections and more transparent reporting of cruise ship crimes, using her experience to help others avoid similar victimization. Subscribe to Verified Fears for more shocking true stories that reveal the dark side of the travel industry. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode that could save your life or protect your family. Share this video with anyone you know who's planning a cruise. Knowledge is the best defense against becoming a victim of crime at sea.